Sup guys? I was bored the other day and updated my destroyer tier list with some newer ships. It was done more or less on a whim, and I'm not going to pretend that I compared vast amounts of empirical data and did head-to-head comparisons between each ship, since tier lists are not what I would call the most important or accurate information, but rather something just to do for fun. Personally, I'd say it shows the bias of the creator more than anything. Not necessarily a negative bias, but just which aspects they consider to be more important. Regardless, I feel like I did a pretty good job here and would be able to justify the placements of every ship with strong arguments. I'll just go over them briefly. In S tier, I put destroyers that are completely unrivaled at their preferred role by any ship in the lower tiers. For Shimakaze, it would be damage against heavy, and for Taiyuan, it would be damage against light, and both of them deal the most damage against medium. Lafy is the best destroyer for pretty much anything other than pure damage, and Kagumo offers the most amount of damage to the entire fleet in a carrier fleet. So, just to reiterate, no ships below S tier can compete in terms of damage against Taiyuan and Shimakaze, none of the tanks are better than Lafy, and none of them can contribute more than Kagumo in a carrier fleet. In the A tier, we have the other two DDGs, which are generally weaker than Taiyuan now for most situations. These days there are quite a lot of options to go around for light armor such as Plymouth, Hindenburg, or Aurora, so it's pretty rare that I sortie more than one DDG at a time. For that reason, I separated Taiyuan from her sisters. Jervis and Felix are just both tanks. There are some who say Felix is tankier than Jervis, but I have never seen empirical data to support that claim. Felix in particular offers nothing special aside from her survivability, but her damage is higher than Jervis. If you're just looking for a tank with decent damage, then you're probably better off looking for a ship from another hull class in my opinion. Given that she's a pure stat stick, Lafy outperforms her in pretty much all scenarios. Jervis, while having slightly lower damage, actually does have unique things to offer even compared to Lafy. She offers a small heal to your vanguard every battle, and also has anti-submarine buffs, making her anti-submarine damage better than Lafy's. If Lafy's anti-submarine damage was not good enough to solo submarines in chapters 14 and 15, perhaps Jervis could move up to S tier, but Lafy, along with an anti-submarine plane, does the job fine, so there's not much reason to use Jervis over Lafy. But if you're farming chapter 14-4 with 2 leveling vanguards, since anti-air is not needed, maybe the heal that Jervis provides to your other 2 vanguards can be more useful than the extra damage and AA provided by Lafy, but it's uncommon enough of a situation that I will just put her in A tier. In any case, the fact that she has anything to offer over Lafy is why I put her just in front of Felix, despite having noticeably lower damage. Kawakaze is also in this tier. She has no weaknesses against any armor type, all her damage ignores shields, she offers slight buffs to other IJN destroyers, and she has very low equipment requirements. However, her damage just can't compare to the damage dealers in S tier, which is why she finds herself in A tier instead. In B tier, Hatsuzuki and Otto are both chunky stat sticks, but are pretty much direct downgrades of Felix in A tier. Hatsuzuki is less tankier than Otto, but should be tanky enough to perform as the main tank for a lot of campaign content, and she also offers a bit of damage reduction to your entire fleet, so she could be valuable even if you don't use her as the primary tank, something that Otto and Felix do not provide. Nonetheless, her stats are just slightly lower than the KMS destroyers, so I put her here. Moving on. Okay, so Yudachi is a bit of a weird one. Her retrofit dropped on the same event as Shimakaze, and at the time there were a lot of people who actually considered Yudachi to be the better of the two, due to her better survivability and lower reliance on torpedoes for her damage. The problem is, not only are there ships that are much tankier than her now, but the value of tankiness itself has also been diminished. Just check the meta team comps from back in the day, many of which required at least Anchorage or A gear as the main tank, and in some cases both were used for more consistent setups, whereas recently you can get away with using full damage vanguards quite easily. In late game stages, You do want a very bulky main tank, but for the other two slots you can get away with much squishier ships if your fleet is properly constructed. However, Yudachi herself is not quite tanky enough to be a main tank for that content anyway. In terms of damage, while she is capable of dealing pretty decent damage against all armor types, having a lot of her damage come from her main guns makes her weak to shields, which makes it worse than Kawakaze in campaign. While one might be able to put together some arguments like, oh, but she's tankier, or her damage is great, in practice, I myself rarely choose her for any situation, hence the placement here. Actually, I will move her up to the top of B tier because her damage is better than Otto and Hachizuki's, but I won't put her ahead of Kawakaze. While B tier might sound like a low tier, keep in mind that she is still a top 10 destroyer, and a lazier tier list might just put all the ships in front of her in one tier and call it a day. She is by no means a weak ship. The final ship in the tier is Hamon 2. She's kind of like the opposite of a stat stick, where she has no damage and is quite squishy, but offers everything else including anti-air, carrier buff, anti-submarine, and flagship protection. Everything she offers is very useful in chapter 15, so I had to put her here. I could see an argument for putting her even higher, but I don't really use her much, so I don't feel like it. Next, in C tier, I think in the previous version I might have had it as the cute tier, but this time it's just a regular tier. These ships are among the strongest of the remaining ships which did not make it into B tier. I just chose 5 because I didn't want to bloat up the tier list with ships that aren't particularly strong or weak. Some other ships that might borderline make it in or are just below this tier include the likes of Sumner, Attilio, Suzuki, and so on. There are some ships that may be very good, but I personally have never used, like Mary Rose. I think that there are enough choices already in B tier and above for gameplay purposes, and you shouldn't have to dip further than this to find a strong ship for gameplay purposes. If you're just going to level ships for fleet tech, or you want to use a ship for waifu reasons, then why the hell are you looking at a tier list? How is it going to change your decision in any way? Okay, now, when I was making my tier list, I was checking with the English community tier list and Chinese wiki tier list to make sure I didn't forget any ships, and I noticed some really terrible tiering decisions, and now I just need to talk about it. Before I begin, I just want to say there's nothing personal. I could bring this criticism to them in their server, but why would I do that for free when I can put it in a video and get enough ad revenue to buy myself a spicy chicken sandwich from Popeyes? Additionally, it seems like every single Azurling community hates every other one for some reason, despite the fanbase as a whole generally being pretty chill. So by picking on ECTL, everyone else will be cheering from the sidelines, despite the fact that, broadly speaking, ECTL probably gets more right than a lot of other communities. These days, they are a lot more inactive with updates, so I'm pretty much doing charity work here. Also, I feel like they don't put as much scrutiny into their tierings as they had in the past, but maybe I'm hallucinating about something that never happened. A lot of criticism tends to get brushed aside with a simple, we just haven't gotten around to making the changes yet, but some things have gone unchecked for far too long. I still don't understand how they never put Shinano in whatever the highest tier is, regardless of what the name is, especially after Haku, who should have been on the higher end of tier 0 to begin with, got about a 15% increase in damage with her fate simulation, and was only just barely able to catch up to Shinano. In fact, still having lower output than Shinano when Shinano's requirements can be satisfied, but carriers are a topic for another time. Going back to destroyers, some general trends I notice are a heavy bias towards anti-light damage, gun damage, and survivability. I will first start off with the most egregious oversight from them that somehow went unnoticed the first time I went over their tier list. Shimakaze has a tag on her which says that her placement is dependent on her ability to significantly impact the battle with her preload, which implies that she is worse than the other ships in this tier without her preloads pulling a lot of the weight. So if you just read all their tiering guidelines and then do a fair, good faith reading of the tier list, it's completely reasonable to get the takeaway that Shimakaze needs the preload to be able to match the other ships in this tier. And I think this has probably been around for as long as Shimakaze and this tag has. I hope that, without elaborating further, you can already kind of tell what the problem is, but I will do it anyway. Where should I even begin? Her damage, especially against heavy, is levels above all the other ships in this tier, even without the preload. Also, preloads are not all built equally. Picture in your head what a Shimakaze preload actually looks like. Realistically, each torp is going to hit for about 4k barring crits, multiplied by 8 to 10 torps depending on your choice of torpedoes. She also has a torpedo stat scaling barrage tied to her torps, so if her preload actually hits, you're looking at a pretty realistic total of upwards of 40k damage just from her preload alone. If the enemies have enough HP to allow it, that is. Now, is that really necessary for her to be on the same level as a ship like Kitakaze? A criticism that Shimakaze often gets is that she's unreliable due to her reliance on torpedoes. But on auto with quad mags and spread reduction, if an enemy is in range when she fires her torps, 3 torps will land most of the time, even higher if there is more than just one enemy. Additionally, despite having obviously some of the strongest torpedoes in the game, her damage from barrages is on the level of Scylla, which for some reason often goes overlooked. There's also the fact that gun damage is heavily stunted by shields, while torpedoes aren't, which is also often overlooked. Shimakaze is probably the weakest relative to other ships when there is just a single enemy and no shields, a situation which often occurs in meta fights. Yet, that's where we actually see her being used the most, even on auto. This is not because she's actually better in meta fights, but rather the fact that people don't know that she's even better in campaign. It's painfully obvious if you tried using Kitakaze in a meta fight, how many leagues above Shimakaze is, even against a single target unshielded enemy. Now put her in a campaign stage, where there are multiple enemies for her torps to have even higher hit rate, and shields that reduce the damage of ships like Kitakaze and Yudachi. The difference becomes night and day. There are also 2 other old criticisms for Shimakaze which either never applied or no longer apply. First is that torpedoes overkill and is useless damage, which I always found to be a bit of a non-argument, as how weak are the enemies you're fighting? And anyone can tell it's no longer true in the later campaign stages these days. The second criticism is that her damage uptime is low because she doesn't have a real gun mount, but for some reason, gunboats with weak torpedo slots are never given the same criticism, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the gun bias. Damage uptime is good, but you don't need it from every single ship, and what Shimakaze brings in torpedo damage is way more than enough to make up for it. Looking at all the ships around her, nobody comes close to her damage against heavy. Only the DDGs and Yudachi get a little close against medium, but against medium these ships have to use the Pompeo gun, so if there's a mix of medium and heavy, their DPS falls off a cliff, and against light she's a bit more in line with some of the others. Okay, I think that's about it for the Shimakaze rant. With that out of the way, let's look at some of the other less egregious tiering decisions that I disagree with. I feel like the preliminary tiering of Ognavoy, as well as Attilio, which they have since adjusted, is an indication of their bias. Ognavoy is the second squishiest ship in this tier, second only to Kitakaze, and has barely any utility as well. Her heal is worth about as much as Jervis's heal or Janus' shield, and she has no other utility on top. She also has extremely weak torps. On paper, she has quite a lot of FP buffs as well as good barrage DPS, which is apparently enough to make them consider her for tier 0, despite all of her obvious shortcomings. In practice, she is just a weaker, squishier version of Scylla with none of the anti-air. She has about 5 layers of RNG to work through to get to her peak potential damage, and averages out to be nothing impressive from my experience. With her weak torpedoes and complete reliance on shelling damage, she is severely hampered by shields and any non-light armor enemy. I'd wager that she could output as much damage as Shimakaze on escort nodes if all the stars aligned for her RNG skills. Then, as Shimakaze gets significantly stronger against carrier and then battleship nodes, she gets significantly weaker. And yet, they somehow end up in the same tier. In the case of Attilio, which to their credit, they realized she was a bit overrated afterwards, there was a lot of excitement about being able to deal damage through shields with her arcing barrage, without realizing that torpedoes have been doing that for as long as the game has existed. Another bias I mentioned previously is survivability. In the case of Otto and Felix, putting aside the fact that Felix is straight up better in terms of damage and survivability, their high tiering makes sense if we hypothetically pretended that we can only use destroyer tanks, as when it comes to tank ships that can output good damage, other hull classes have much better options. I don't mean that they should tier cross-hull, which they explicitly state they don't, but rather just put less emphasis on survivability for destroyers. However, I will acknowledge that this point may just be my bias, and I can accept that other players may have a ton of success with Felix and Otto, but I personally just don't find them to be particularly special, at least not more so than Jervis, who also heals your Vanguard. While tankiness is overvalued, squishiness is underpenalized, as there are tier 1 ships that are a bit bulkier than Kitokaze and Ognivoy but deal a bit less damage, yet the damage is given priority over the squishiness. I should also mention that they always consider their destroyers with only 2 toolbox setups. Since I actually play the game and don't just playtest for them, it could actually be the case that everything I said was wrong if I normalized all my ships to have 2 toolboxes, although I seriously doubt it. To penalize the ship for being squishy, I generally consider using offensive auxiliary on the bulkier ship when comparing damage head to head. For example, since Taiyuan with an Oxytorp and a Seal of the 4 Gods is as tanky as Ognivoy with 2 HP auxiliaries, a more fair way to compare their damage would be to use Oxy and Seal on Taiyuan, while using 2 toolboxes on Ognivoy in my opinion. As for their tier 1, I won't say much about Kagumo as there's nothing really to be said that I haven't already said, and it seems like their position is set in stone, so I won't bother. This is pretty much the epitome of their guns good, torps bad philosophy. Before I forget, for quite a long time they were against tiering with rainbow equipment taken into account, and I don't know if they have since then changed their stance on it, but ships like Shimakaze, Kawakaze, and Kagumo can reach their peak performance without the rainbow gun, while gun-focused destroyers are missing a lot of damage if that is not taken into account. One last thing I want to mention is about Lafy 2. I believe their placement of her in EX is an overreaction to how much she trivializes Chapter 15, despite the fact that they have never given consideration for a ship being especially good in a single chapter. Being in Tier X implies that her damage is on the level of Tier 0 ships, but she has extra perks on top, except it's not true and goes to show just how off base Tier 0 is. Try replacing your Shimakaze with Lafy against the heavy armor enemy, or Taiyuan with Lafy against the light armor enemy, or either one against medium armor, and see the difference for yourself. Granted, she also has some utility for a specific USS carrier fleet, but that is something that they never consider for tiering. Speaking of ships that are particularly good in Chapter 15, if Lafy is Tier EX, then what's Hamon 2 doing down in Tier 4? At the cost of having to use another tank, Hamon can also take care of the anti-air, anti-submarine, contribute a lot of damage via air raid assist, including fighter interception damage, and she also provides flagship cover, which is pretty handy to have. And just a fun fact, she's actually tankier than Kitakaze. Anyway, it's about time to wrap up the video. I'm just tired of the Shimakaze disrespect, and to be fair, the Chinese wiki tier list also severely underrates her, but they don't understand what I'm saying, so I wouldn't be able to get as many people upset from talking about them. I hope that some of these criticisms will be considered in their next update for the sake of a better tier list for everyone who uses it. Please, if you can, do consider my arguments for what they are, and not because I'm a content creator with a bunch of subscribers. If you disagree with any of the points I brought up, Feel free to write about it in the comments, and I will respond to all the points worth responding to. Alrighty, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.